This is another 3.5 pages of notes day, and so I've got to get through them pretty fast, and so we're going to have to start pretty close to on time and scoot along as we go. So as you can see up here, this is Solving the Exodus Mystery. We're studying a book by Ted Stewart that was written in about 1999. Ted Stewart was an instructor at the Sunset International Bible Institute in Lubbock, Texas. He also was the owner of the Sunset Bookstore, he and his wife Dot. And so I knew them for many years. He had a hobby. Egyptology was his hobby. And he was not an archaeologist. He didn't go over there and uncover any of the things that are in his book. It all was stuff that was discovered by archaeologists, written in their books, written in histories. He just was kind of a nerd when it came to this stuff, and he just read everything and was looking and seeing what was out there that could solve this problem. And that is that archaeologists are just unable to fit the things in the Bible story with any particular period of Egypt's history. Part of the reason was because of the dating. Part of the reason was because of the length of time that they were thinking the Bible story, that their stay in Egypt was 430 years, when in reality, he points out in the Bible that that's the length of time from when Abraham was called until the Exodus. But they were only in Egypt for about 210 years, 232 if you count the length of time that Joseph got there until the Exodus. So none of that's in the lesson today, but today is the fourth part of our series. We've had 3 lessons so far. The first 2 lessons were about dating and getting the dates and times correct, which I think he did. And then the third part has to do with finding Joseph, and how the story of Joseph and his imprisonment and being elevated to vizier, or the chief advisor to the Pharaoh, how that could fit into Egyptian history. Thought that was pretty interesting last week, but this time we want to look at Joseph as the vizier and the reign of Sesostris I. And like usual, I'm not giving you the notes yet, I don't think. Have we? Michelle, are you giving them out? All right, she's got them under lock and key. And so when the class is over, she's going to put them on the back table along with the videos. And so the videos are all back in. The ones that were taken out last week are all back in. The video is not about this book. It is a new video series that has come out within the last year. It kind of comes to the same conclusions about the dating and timing, that there's a problem there. But I think the book actually has a lot more interesting details than what they uncovered in the videos, the way I see it. But anyway, it's worth looking and seeing another perspective. So, there appears to be associations between Joseph's story and the 12th Egyptian dynasty, mostly because of the circumstances surrounding Amenemhet I, who was the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, an assassination attempt against him from within his own palace. His closest servants and officials, the guard that, his secret service, some of them turned against him. There was a battle. He was wounded. He was never the same again, so he had a co-reign with his son, Sesostris I, who really is the main guy in the story, the opening story of Joseph. So the biblical account of Joseph rising to be the vizier, we're going to use that word because that's the word that the historians use. The second in command of the Pharaoh, the vizier. The story of his rising to that position and the story of the vizier of Sesostris I have a lot in common. So last time we looked at these things. there's a good reason we see in history why there were two palace officials that were in prison. There was a good reason why Pharaoh appointed a deceiving foreigner. Amenemhet I warns Sesostris, don't trust anybody that you know. Don't trust anybody that you would think would be a good counselor to you. Be slow in appointing anybody to be the vizier. We saw that in a letter that was written from Amenemhet to Sesostris. So there was a reason in the biblical story tells that this foreigner, Joseph, was raised to that level. History tells us a good reason why that could have been. There was a common description of these two, Joseph and the vizier of Sesostris I. We looked at all of these things, both in the Bible and in history, that both were regarded as the royal seal bearer, the sole companion and privy counselor, overseer of the gold houses and the silver houses, counselor of the two diadems. So we talked about all that, and I can't get too bogged down in going back over what we did last time because we got so much more to say today. Joseph's marriage coincides with the vizier of Sesostris being at the same place that Joseph was at, both of them in Heliopolis, and the two stories, appropriate names. The name that was given to Joseph, Zephanath-Paneah, was a common name during the 12th dynasty, as was the name of his wife, Asenath, her father, Potipharah. That still bother you? Anyway. Also, we talked about the timing of Joseph's two sons. It said that his sons were born before the days of famine came. That would have fit with the timing of the story of the vizier of Sesostris I. So, one other thing we noticed was Joseph's story wouldn't have fit in any other dynasty. This story, the way that all of this coincides, only fits in this one place. It couldn't have been in the 11th dynasty. It couldn't have been at the end of the 12th dynasty, only at the beginning of the 12th dynasty. It couldn't have been in the 13th through the 18th dynasties. There just wasn't any place, any time, but it fits just right here at this spot. But what we want to talk about today is, what about the famine? What about the years of plenty and the years of famine? Do we see that in the 12th dynasty? Were there 7 years of abundance in the reign of Sesostris I? All right, in Genesis 41, verses 34 to 37, I'm just going to, by the way, you ought to turn to Genesis. We're going to read a little bit in chapter 41. We're going to read some in chapter 47. I just want to read this one part in verse 34. It says, this is Joseph's advice to the Pharaoh. Let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let them exact a fifth of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Appoint overseers in charge of the land. So that was his advice. I'm just going to go and put this part up here right now. Bresnan, in his book History of Egypt, says that a royal commissioner, whose duty it was to look to the interest of Pharaoh, existed in each nome. A nome was a state capital. If you were to call the various regions of Egypt states, then a nome was the state capital. A royal commissioner was appointed. That is what Joseph was advising to Pharaoh, and that's what we see happen in history. Also in Genesis 41, 46 to 49, Joseph's work during the 7 years of abundance, it says he went all throughout the land, and he was overseeing the gathering up of the grain and the building of various things. In his book, History of Egypt, James Bresnan made that comment. In earlier dynasties, There was no evidence found of royal commissioners who were stationed in the nomes in this way. This was a new system. What was appointed by Sesostris I had not been to have these commissioners around like this. There was no evidence of that in the past. So that coincides with what the Bible says was going to happen. Storing of grain in Egypt was a common thing, like it is anywhere. I mean, what do we do when we take grain? We store it, right? I mean, that's just a common thing that people do. But it wasn't common for it to be recorded or especially memorialized. You sure didn't see any other times where they had a great big deal in tombs where the gathering of grain was memorialized. It's just something that was done, but not anything special. Numhotep, don't you love these names? It sounds like something right out of a mummy movie. Numhotep, the mummy. Well, Numhotep, he was the governor of the Oryx nome in the reign of Sesostris I. On the wall of his tomb is depicted a scene of both national and state officials collecting and storing up grain in a granary. And that's right. Oh, I've got a stick. That's what they're doing right there. They're gathering up and storing up grain, and that's a featured thing right under his image. You see this, it seems like a big deal. Other such scenes from the 12th dynasty, and this is just a little bit of a blow up here for you. By the way, these are doors, and these doors, are about like 10 times the size of the person. It's huge. This is a huge deal here. And you can see it goes on back to other rooms and other huge doors. But this is on one wall. And it says here, Ted Stewart said that other such scenes from the 12th dynasty are found throughout Egypt in other tombs, all the way to the southern border. In other words, this harvest seemed to be a big deal for some reasons. And they were not usually memorialized in this way. Not only was food being stored during the first century, or the first years of Sesostris' reign, but water also was being stored up. A big reservoir was built. The vizier of Sesostris I was in charge of a great construction project. I'm going to move over here, get out of the way. A great construction project near the city of Heliopolis, which was up in here. Okay, and close to that, there was a big construction project for a reservoir in that area. Great retention walls were built, eventually spanning 27 miles in length at the site of Lake Moeris, allowing for greater depth and volume of water around that area. And this was in the first years of Sesostris I. The vast lake was fed by a 200-mile-long canal, where the Nile would flow into it, and this canal spanned 200 miles until it hit the area where the reservoir was. During the time that the Nile was high, the water would flow through that canal and into the reservoir. Whenever the times that the Nile was low, there were irrigation ditches and trenches that went out from it that fed the various farming endeavors around throughout the land. That was going on. So there are some interesting facts about this ingenious canal. For one thing, it connected some existing waterways that were along the way with man-made trenches that made for one long canal, as is often done by other people in other countries. But its construction was begun in the first few years of Sesostris' reign. And the name of the name of it is Bar Yusuf. The name of it is the Joseph Canal. Isn't that interesting? And it was begun in the first years of Sosthenes' reign. So, okay, speeding right along. Let's see, I did it. Okay, so years of famine occurred in Egypt because, there were seldom years of famine because of the consistent flow of the Nile. I mean, the Nile was just always there. So they didn't have famines very often. But when a famine did occur, there would be records of it. The Egyptians recorded these things in inscriptions. One is noted at the end of the 5th dynasty. There was a famine. Famines were recorded in the 10th and the 11th dynasties. But this big one is recorded in the 12th dynasty. I want to look at Genesis 47. I want to read this section to you. I want to read all of this. It's a long section, but I want us to hear it exactly as it is in the Bible as we then turn and see what was going on in Egyptian history at this time. So we're going to start at verse 13. Genesis 47:13. Now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So everybody paid money to get grain. And when the money was all spent, it says, in all the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is all gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. So now their money's all gone, and now their livestock is all gone. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said, "We will not hide from my Lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my Lord's. There's nothing left for my Lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every Egyptian sold his field because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. Now Pharaoh's got all the money, he's got all the livestock, he's got all the land. And as for the people, verse 21, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. So they got to keep their land, and he gave them food, basically. He was taking care of them in allotments. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land." So the land belonged to Pharaoh, but he's given them seed that they can go work the land that belongs to Pharaoh. And at the harvest, he said, "You shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed of the field, and for your food, for those of your households, and as food for your little ones." So he said, "I'm going to lease the land back to you on an 80-20 land share situation. I'll give you the seeds. Okay, you work the land is my land. You work it, you get to keep 4/5 of it, or 80% of the harvest, and 20% is paid back to Pharaoh." So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." Now he owns the people too. And Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that is, to the day that Moses was writing this. Many years later, Moses is writing this. He said, this same situation is in force today when I'm writing this. That Pharaoh should have a fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. Okay. So there's the way the Bible spells that out pretty specifically, pretty plainly as well. So the gist of the thing is that the famine devastated the land and the land of the surrounding countries. And so stored grain was traded for money till the money was all gone, and traded for livestock until Pharaoh had all the livestock, and until he had all the land. But the land belonging to the priest was not taken according to the Bible, and afterwards the land was leased back to the people on an 80-20 sharecrop basis. All right, that's the gist of what we saw there. The tomb of Numhotep depicts more than just scenes of grain collection. Numhotep died in the 18th year of the reign of Sesostris I. He served as governor of the Oryx Nome before the days of abundance and famine. He served as the governor during the days of abundance and famine, and he served after the days of abundance and famine. Numhotep was there as governor the entire time of this situation. During his last years of life, his son, Amini, carried out his father's duties, the ancient transcripts say, as a man represents his old father. In his annals, that is, in the annals of Amini, he claims that when years of famine came, he cared for the Oryx Nome, preserving its people alive and furnishing its food so that there was none hungry therein. So here we find that in the days of Numhotep, he is collecting stuff, and Amini is giving out stuff so that nobody would starve. Both Amini and Numhotep are both buried in the same tomb. On the wall in this tomb is depicted a giant figure of Amini. And before him is shown, we'll just enlarge it there, a vast line of people coming into his presence. Some were Egyptians, some were foreigners. They all carried various articles of value, livestock, slaves, gold, which they were trading to Amini in exchange for grain. The same tomb, and that's, never mind, you see what it is. The same tomb in which Numhotep is shown collecting vast quantities of grain also shows his son Amini distributing this grain in time of famine. I guess you're picking up the gist that it sounds a lot like the biblical story, and this is during the reign of Sesostris I. If Joseph was appointed vizier and thus began the famine preparation in the second year of Sesostris, that would have been 2 years after the butler was released from prison and told the Pharaoh about Joseph, and he was given that position. If this all started in the second year of Sesostris I, then the years of plenty would have been years 2 through 8 of Sesostris. And the years of famine would have been years 9 through 15 of Sesostris' reign. And these are the very years that Numhotep and Amini are depicted in their tombs. This one tomb here exemplifies what was happening all over Egypt. Genesis 41:47 says that there were storehouses in every city. And what is shown in this tomb is exactly what is depicted in Genesis 41, verse 56 and 57. People came from every nation, and especially Egypt, to buy grain. Okay, so there seems to be some connection, some correlation between the biblical story and the Egyptian story during the reign of Sesostris I. It seems to Ted Stewart. Now, how might you expect a king to fare after a huge famine? You think he'd be doing very well? Would there be a struggle? Would there be a long period of recovery after a thing like that? The reign of Sesostris I, following the Great Famine, was characterized by expansion, actually. William Hayes, in the Cambridge Ancient History, describes it this way. Secure upon his throne, Sesostris I was able to devote his great energy, ability, and breadth of vision to a program for the enrichment and expansion of Egypt more grandiose than any heretofore undertaken. At least 35 sites, from Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast to Aswan on the First Cataract, had yielded buildings or other monuments of King Sesostris I. There was hardly a temple of any importance in Upper or Lower Egypt that was not enlarged or embellished by this great Pharaoh. Now, is that what you would expect? Obviously, there was a great famine because it is depicted in the tombs all over the place during the years of Sesostris, and yet you find that he's doing even better than ever afterwards. How did he fare so well? Ladies and gentlemen, we have finished 2 pages. We're moving right along here. Genesis 47, which we read a few minutes ago, says that he should have owned huge herds of livestock, right? Because the Bible said that they gave up their livestock for grain. In the ancient records of Egypt, I'm getting the R in the wrong place here. Breasted cites a quotation from the inscription of Amini. What did Amini say? He said, the gang overseers of the crown possessions, the gang overseers, gangs of, they're overseeing the herds is what it's talking about here. Gang overseers of the crown possessions of the shepherds of the Oryx known gave me 3,000 bulls and their yokes. I carried all their dues to the king's house. Okay, and then Breasted himself comments on this and said, Amini received a herd of 3,000 cattle from the royal herds to be maintained by him on shares. That's the way the Bible said that they did it. He got all the cattle, and then he gave a portion to them. They were kind of leased out to them. Amini had to pay annual dues to the king's palace to pay for these herds that were loaned or leased out to him from Sesostris, the crown possessions. That's what it's talking about. That meant that Sesostris must have owned multiplied thousands of cattle, from which 3,000 were loaned to this one governor, the governor of the Oryx known. He loaned him 3,000. He had to pay dues back to the king. Another governor, Thuthotep of the Harry known, is also reported to have had great numbers of cattle from the king. So the Bible says that Pharaoh should have owned huge herds of livestock. We find that he is leasing out livestock, 3,000 at a time, to the governors throughout the land. The Atlas of Ancient Egypt lists 42 different nomes in Egypt at this time. If Sesostris loaned 3,000 cattle to each governor, that would have amounted to 126,000 royal cattle that were out on loan, in addition to the cattle that were controlled by his gang overseers. That's a lot of cattle. How did Sesostris I in Egyptian history accumulate such vast herds after years of famine? Well, we kind of have an idea that it happened the way the Bible said that it happened. Another thing is that Sesostris should have owned all the land in the country, according to Genesis 47, which we read. He should have had all the land except for the priest's land. Okay, in the ancient records of Egypt, by the way, that is the title of a book, The Ancient Records of Egypt, is found a record of 3 contracts that were made by a guy named Hepzefi. He was a priest who was appointed governor by Sesostris I. Hepzefi. There are 3 contracts, and we find 3 things in these 3 contracts. Number 1, we find that Sesostris I commanded that part of the proceeds of his royal property should go to the temple priests. The way it says in Genesis 47, verse 22, Hepzefi says, well, that's the way this contract is laid out. The second thing is that a bushel of grain from every field should be given to the temple priests by every citizen. What did they call that in... it was an allotment or something like that. Yeah, verse 22, 47:22. The priest had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Well, if all the land and all the grain belonged to Pharaoh, then the grain that's given to the priest would have been an allotment from Pharaoh. So Hepzefi said that's part of the deal, that's what we were doing, and that's what the Bible said was going on. Also, Hepzefi himself owned personal property, which he said is my property of my paternal estate. It was my father's estate, it's now my estate, my property. But it's not, he said, it's not the property of the count's estate. Pharaoh doesn't own this land, for I am a priest's son. So the Bible says that all the land belonged to Pharaoh except the land of the priests. And here's a guy who is a priest who says, well, this land belongs to me because I'm a priest. Other ancient records confirm that Sesostris I had supervisors who checked on his royal property in every corner of the country. Moses said this practice continued until the time that he wrote Genesis. 100 years after the reign of Sesostris I, a governor under Amenemhet III wrote that he was overseer of the royal property and gave contracts for the remuneration of the prophets or the priests. This practice was still going on. It was a new practice, a new thing that started in the time of Sesostris. It's still going on 100 years later, as Moses said that it was. So these were, pretty ingenious leasing laws that made Sesostris a very rich and powerful person. And they continue to the end of the 12th dynasty. Well, what else should we see? We should see that Pharaoh has a vast host of slave laborers. Because in Genesis 47, we read that the people said, just make us your slaves. We belong to you because you have saved our lives. Genesis 47:18. Verse 21, Genesis 47:21 says that Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. So that's the biblical account. Now what do we see in Egyptian history? Hayes described this aspect of the latter reign of Sesostris I this way. He said, the ancient quarries of Cheops swarmed with Egyptian working parties. In Sesostris' 38th year, an expedition of more than 17,000 men quarried the blocks for 60 sphinxes and 150 statues. And you wonder, is this how you would expect a Pharaoh coming out of a famine to have this many slave laborers from among his own people? that are doing these vast construction projects. How could Sesostris employ 17,000 men on just one work project, while simultaneously constructing other expensive building projects from one end of Egypt to the other after a devastating famine? How could that have been? Well, we know. We think that the Bible explains how that went. Apparently, the Egyptians didn't mind serving Sesostris I. The Bible says that they said, hey, just make us your servant, make us your slaves because you've saved us. That's what the Bible says. But Hayes explains that Sesostris I was regarded and invoked as a god. How were you so ingenious that you could have saved our land in a devastating famine like this? They were happy to serve him. History says. That's what Hayes in Cambridge Ancient History says about Sesostris and his people. And this parallels Genesis 47, verse 25. Okay, so, boy, you like that quick little tour? Yeah. There are many other events in the 12th dynasty history which actually parallels the biblical story. There were those that we mentioned at the beginning of our lesson. The reason the palace officials were imprisoned, the discerning foreigner put in as a vizier, all of those things we talked about last week. Now this week we've added some more things. A new system of royal commissioners that was started by Sesostris I, which had not existed before in Egyptian history. And the Bible says that this was the suggestion of Joseph, and that's what his Pharaoh in the Bible did. Notable storage of food and water throughout Egypt. This is what we see in Egyptian history. This is what the Bible says was happening in Joseph's time. The Joseph Canal, now that's not mentioned in the Bible, but it goes along with the preparation that was made for a great famine, so that when the Nile ran low, there was water that was stored in this vast reservoir. Scenes in tombs of Egyptians and foreigners coming and buying grain, and then vast herds, royal land, slave-powered projects after the famine, and the decree that the priests should keep their land and be subsidized because they're priests. So all of these things, all of these documented historical events in the reign of Sesostris I harmonize with the biblical account surrounding the story of Joseph. Okay. So what do you think? What do you think about that? Steve? We have some time here, so.
Has there been any refuting of this by the people that are supposedly experts?
You have to watch the video.
Because I would think that they would be threatened by something, and so there would be a rebuttal from them saying that this is impossible.
Well, they would dismiss it. For one thing, the 12th dynasty is not the right time period as far as they're concerned. They couldn't have been at that time.
But I would have thought if I was doing history, I would have ignored time and looked where events meshed up, and then tried to figure out what the conflict was there.
Well, let's say that you are a college student and you're studying archaeology, and you got to memorize all this stuff so you can make the test. And after a period of time, the way that you have learned it, that's the way that it is. It's substantiated by history. We've settled this. And somebody comes along and says, well, what about all this stuff here? Well, it's the wrong time period, it's the wrong length of time, and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, I don't know what has happened exactly since the time of Ted Stewart writing this. In the video, the main experts, the archaeologists that they interviewed, are still ignoring it and saying, no, that's not that. Yeah, Rod?
Well, I was going to say, they're stuck on Ramses or
Ramses.
Ramsey.
Yeah, they're stuck on Ramses. They think that Ramses, that has to be when it was. But it doesn't fit the time of Ramses. So, you know how it is. For how many years did I go teaching, preaching all the time that the Israelites were in Egypt 430 years? I taught that myself for a long time. But then, Ted Stewart took all of this time. We spent 2 class periods looking at seeing how the timetable should fit. And so I saw it and I went, okay, I'm going to go ahead and accept that, and let's see how that fits. But that's going to have to happen with other people. And the video actually shows how the timetable can be lined up. I don't know if when you see it, you'll see he's got this big wall. Okay, this great big wall is a diagram, and he's got, the early period of Egyptian history, the middle period, and then the latter period. And in between each of these periods, there is a dark area because they don't know how long that period was. And so they say, well, it's so long. They just kind of guess at that. And this one is so long, and this is so long. But if they're wrong about how long those periods are between those, that time was between those periods, then that could be shortened, and it shifts everything back and lines it up. And the guy that did the video said, he thinks that's the way they're going to be able to coincide that. And if they do, then the time lines up with this dynasty, the period of the dynasty, 200 and something years rather than 400 and something, then that all lines up. And what you're going to see in lessons 5, 6, 7, and 8 is more and more things that happen as we move along through the 12th dynasty, through the other pharaohs, and how it coincides with the Bible as well. But it's not easy to change the minds of people that have been ingrained in something for a really long time. Does that make any sense? Another question?
I just hoping there might have been some movement in people's thinking.
The only way I would know that is based on the video, because it was done just this past year.
Okay, it's that fresh.
Yeah.
But there are some guys, of course, that he's interviewing who are in agreement, total agreement with this coincidence of the Bible. But other guys that just aren't, and they won't be probably. It doesn't matter to me what they think. What matters is, do I believe this evidence? Does it look to me like it is substantiated, well, historically? Is it substantiated biblically? And so it makes sense to me. Okay, I'm going to let you go. Everybody's yawning, stretching, ready to go.
It went down some days,